He didn't set out to start a movement, just to stay sober and be a better dad. What happened next? Well, it might just inspire your next big step.
Welcome to the Sober Life Rocks podcast. You may have made the decision not to drink alcohol, or at the very least, not at work-related events. Whether you've never been a drinker, are in recovery, or made a health-related decision, we see you, and you are not alone. In today's world, networking, socializing, and celebrations often happen over drinks, and the struggle can be real. Through this podcast, we're changing that narrative. We're here to create a community where individuals like you, who choose not to drink or drink less, can find camaraderie, support, and practical advice.
Welcome to the Sober Life Rocks podcast, where we amplify sober voices from around the world. I'm your host, Margy Schaller, and today's guest is someone who's redefining what sober fatherhood looks like, one episode at a time. Stephen Kimball is the creator and host of the Sober Dad Crew podcast, a raw, real, and often hilarious deep dive into parenting, recovery, music, and everything in between. A longtime music lover with a background in the punk scene, Stephen got sober in 2020 and quickly realized how few spaces existed for dads navigating sobriety and fatherhood at the same time. So he built one. Through candid conversations with other sober dads, his podcast has grown into a supportive, no BS community that's helping men stay sober, stay connected, and show up for their kids in powerful new ways. Whether he's talking tattoos or tantrums or triggers, Stephen brings heart, humor, and honesty to everything he does. Today, we'll explore how his sobriety reshaped his identity, why vulnerability is a game changer for men in recovery, and what it really takes to show up fully and sober for people who matter most. Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, happy to be here. And just one little clarification. It was actually 2010. So I'm 15 years. So don't short me a decade.
Right? That is super important.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you launched the Sober Dad Crew podcast during your own recovery. Like, what was missing from the sober space that you felt called to create?
I mean, you saw a lot of sun. I kind of riffed on Sober Dad Crew from some of the sober mom stuff that was out there. And there was a lot of that out there. And a lot of discussions about mommy wine time and that kind of marketing. But I always felt like, there's this sort of beer time for dudes, during sports and all that stuff. So I felt like there was an opening. And I think in general, even outside of sobriety, often the conversation around parenting doesn't always include dads. And I think I like to redefine that too, as someone who many, many years ago stayed at home with my oldest as an infant, that, fatherhood's really important outside of sobriety.
Well, so let's take you back then just to a little bit about your own journey with kind of where your drinking led and then into why you quit drinking.
Yeah, I always sort of describe myself as it was my medicine. There was a lot of depression and anxiety that had gone on for a long time, sort of low level and amped up. And honestly, having kids increased that. It's just more stressful. Money's harder, all those things. So the one glass of wine kind of became 2, became 3 at night. My first marriage to my older two's mom was shaky. We had moved in with her father with Parkinson's disease, and that certainly didn't help any of that. That's not to place blame on anything because you make your decisions. And really one night, I just had this realization, and I really talk about my grandmother who had passed, I felt like she kind of tapped me on the shoulder and was like, not that way. There's nothing good that way. And that was it. I was done. Did a ton of therapy. So I don't do a formal 12-step program or anything. Respect to those. I think respect to what process works for each person. But for me, there's a lot of years of therapy and sort of unpacking the the depression and learning to manage anxiety and depression and all those things. Which then as a single father for years and years was a vital tool because money was just even tighter. It was even harder. You make career choices, maybe a little bit on what the job is and the money it will give you as opposed to your passions. Um, so all those things kind of really, really intersect.
So tell me a little bit about your own experience from the point of view of being a dad, using that alcohol to kind of cope, and the relationship that you feel like you had, and then what ages were they when you got sober, and what did that look like when it shifted?
Yeah. So the oldest, he'll be 22 in July, and then his sister will be 18 in a week. So those are quote unquote my biological kids. Then I have two step kids who are 9 and
Mhm.
13, but they're really just my kids. I don't think of them any
Yeah,
differently than that.
they're your bonus
So
kids.
yeah, and they are, and it's incredible. I think so. The one who's almost 18, I mean, it's 15 years, right? So she was 3 and her
Mm.
brother was 7. So the almost 18-year-old doesn't really remember, and the oldest a little bit, I think, probably remembers the impatience and the shortness and all that. I was never a drink to get drunk person. Like I could count the times on
Mhm.
my hand that was actually a thing. But that using it to kind of dull and numb was really my relationship with it.
Yeah, my kids were let's see, I think probably about 6 and 9 when I got sober. And I remember while I was drinking, I would come home from work. I never missed work like you. It wasn't about the getting drunk. I didn't like getting drunk. But I remember coming home from work and needing to have a drink before I went out to after their evening activities, before I went to go see their play at the school or before I went to go to see the soccer thing or whatever. But I didn't drink a lot then. I just drank constantly. And so when I told them I was going to go to 30 days of treatment to get sober, both of them were very confused. Like, why? Like, you don't have a problem. And then I remember about 6 months into my sobriety, and my kids, like, I would bring them to meetings with me, or I would do, because I was a single mom at the time. Um, my son was in the back seat. And I don't know about you, but talking with kids, especially sons, face to face was always a challenge. But get him in the back seat where I wasn't staring at him, and he would come up with amazing things. And so he said to me, he said, "Mommy, did you get sober for me and my sister?" And I remember that moment thinking, oof, this is a really important moment. And I said, yes, I want to be the best mom that I can be for you guys. But more importantly, I needed to get sober for me to take care of who I am as a person. And I remember him thinking about that. And I said, I was always wanting to be there for you and your sister. I was always wanting to support you guys. And he said, well, you were there, but you weren't really there.
Yeah, kids are deep, man. They see it.
And I wonder, from the point of view of a dad, can you see that shift for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just fundamentally more present and more patient and more fun,
Mm-hmm.
and more actually forgiving of myself. I always had this notion of like having to be the perfect dad. So like listening to Brene Brown's audiobook, The Gift of Imperfect Parenting, was really important to me because I had this realization like, all right, like perfection, the kind of road to hell can be paved with quest for perfection a little bit. It's like they say progress, not perfection, right? I always say to people, I want to every day be a little bit of a better husband, a little bit of a better dad, a little bit of a better coworker, employee, just a little bit of a better human being. Like if we all incrementally every day just try and just be like a little better at those things, I think the impact would be really great. But I definitely, like, I felt my ability to parent in a better way was definitely like, especially with the therapy, it wasn't just like, oh, I gave up this
Mhm.
thing, right? There was a lot of other stuff that needed to be kind of addressed, right? Or else it's the dry drunk, right? If you don't get to the bottom of
Yeah.
what it is. But I think our stories are interesting too, because we're not at all the stereotype of what people think, right?
Hmm.
Like we weren't stumbling around, but we still had issues.
And the self medication is what it was for me, and sounds like for you as well. But that kind of leads me to another question that I wanted to ask you about, which is that, culturally, we have this thing where men aren't supposed to be vulnerable. Men are supposed to be strong and, you know, slapping their chests and all of that. And yet here you have this podcast that is talking, I'm assuming, about some vulnerable moments. Like how have you been able to kind of create that place?
I think one thing I do when I record, and I sort of have some standard questions. How many kids do you have? Did you always want to be a dad? And then we kind of jump into the story. And I really don't interrupt. And I've gotten feedback on that I just let them tell the story. And I'm really blessed to get those stories. I mean, some of them, people are talking about their suicide attempts. Like there's a lot of trust there that, I'm super grateful for people being willing to share some really like dark, heavy stuff, or how they weren't present for their kids. It's like hard stuff to admit, right? It's hard to admit your flaws and your mistakes and all that, but I think it's just so important to put it out there that we're just all human and we all struggle. And I remember saying to my kids at one point, like, no one ever promised you a flat road, no curves, no bumps. Like that's just not a thing, right? So trying to get stories that show like things happen, but there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. I think like if there was a mission statement, it would be sort of that, to like demonstrate there's a way through these things.
Beautiful, beautiful. And the other thing I kind of wanted to explore with you was this roots in punk rock world of yours. So tell me about that and kind of how that interplays into all of this.
I have this non-scientific theory that I've been putting forth that if you listen to punk when you're 14, it's the gateway. I remember finding the Clash, and this was, of course, I'm old, in the 80s when I was a teenager. It's funny, this afternoon I was in Portland, Maine, because I'm with my folks, and I was in my old sort of stomping grounds for a little while. I grabbed a coffee and was walking around. I was like, oh, I was this little punk kid on these streets so many years ago. But there's sort of this notion, this DIY, do it yourself notion, that I think is kind of fundamental to how I work. And I think this sort of ethical point. So it's really beyond, the music and beyond fashion and more of a philosophy. I'm too old to have a mohawk, like that would be patently ridiculous at 54, to have a very gray-haired mohawk. But I think I always felt a bit of an outsider. I mean, it's where I discovered my politics, in the 80s, in the Cold War and the Reagan years, which is interesting to sort of talk to my kids in the moment now and the weight that they feel. And I remember I was talking to my oldest and I thought, oh, right, he doesn't have this historical perspective that things have been hard before and we persevere. I'm not to, really dive into politics, but that sort of perspective. And it, to me, sort of punk and being a bit of an outsider always fit kind of my personality
Hmm.
and the music.
So how, yeah. And so how do you feel like that then interweaves with what you're doing today with the Sober Dad crew and other parts of your sober journey?
I think a little of it is there's an ethical pulse to it of holding yourself to a high standard, and also rebelliousness, because we live in a culture that pushes alcohol. I mean, other drugs too, but really, watch the Super Bowl, um, all those ads, so many alcohol ads, so much wine culture stuff pushed, at moms. And so I do think there's a level where sobriety is a rebellious act. Um, and assist, the opiate
Isn't that
of the masses
crazy?
is real, right? Like I sort of can't help a little bit to throw my left leaning politics out there, but I feel like the status quo would love us numb, right? And so it is a bit of a rebellious act against a system that kind of wants you to ignore what's going on.
Oh my gosh. I love that. The system would love us numb. I mean, alcohol is big business.
I worked in the wine industry for a while, actually, in the Finger Lakes. The Finger Lakes has a pretty world-class wine region. So I worked in a winery for a while. It was when I was stay-at-home dadding, I poured wine on the weekends. So
Interesting.
yeah.
And this was the candy man giving out the tastes to get people
Yep.
more into it. Absolutely. Yeah. Stephen, because you've had so many guests, I'm guessing that there have been moments that have then shaped your own sober journey. Can you think of any of those that you could share with me?
Yeah, I think in a way the podcast is, it is like my group, Um, I think the first time somebody got on there and just really, I mean, one of my first guests, he was it was just really raw and open. And I think I realized about myself that I was really lucky to turn the corner when I did. Like my rock bottom was still my rock bottom, but it was very different to some of the stories I've heard. So I think whatever cosmic, spiritual, whatever that was, that moment, saved me from a lot. Because I was at a moment when I was able to just redirect, and not everybody has that situation that they've gone further down, or my grandmother, that same grandmother, always talked about being greatly blessed. I have that tattooed on my arm, and she always talked about that. And this was a woman who, was in World War II, had my mom and her two sisters, while my grandfather was in the Navy overseas during World War II. But, no matter how hard things were, she always talked about being greatly blessed. And I think hearing these stories, it's a good reminder of what your own blessings are, and to have gratitude, but also that other people struggle, and that there is a beauty in the struggle and in recovery.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Um, you know, we're hosting this conference, Amplify Sober Voices, next January, for people who want to, in some way or another, be able to share their sober journey and bring others along the way, whether it's podcasting or speaking or blogging or writing a book. I'd love to know, like, what inspired you to start this, and what advice, now that you've been down the road a little ways, would you have for somebody else looking, who has a passion for something, looking to amplify their sober voice?
Yeah, I think it was sort of a little bit of a phase thing. I remember just deciding to put on LinkedIn, I think it was my 12th sober anniversary, putting that up there. And I was in the middle of an interview process for my current position. And I thought, oh my God, like, wait, I just put that out there. What if? And then I realized, well, if they're going to judge that, because I also think like my story and my recovery and all that make me a better employee. Like, I've dealt with my stuff I'm in touch with that. So I did have that moment where I said, wow, I just, here we go. It's out there now. Not that I really ever hit it, but, and maybe we'll touch on this later, workplaces do have a funny vibe towards that, or can. And then I remember sitting on the couch with my wife one night, who's a therapist, does a lot of work around trauma, and saying, I feel like there's this gap out there, and I want to kind of just like try this thing and, put this podcast out there in the world. And at the time, I was on the board of the Alcohol and Drug Council of Tompkins County, which is the county where Ithaca, New York is. And they had an event called Recovery Rocks. And I spoke at it, and I sort of told my story. And there was this other guy there who told his story, and he ended up being my first guest. I just said, hey, I'm thinking of doing this thing. Do you you willing to roll the dice with me, and try this thing? And I got a few more, and I got a few more, and I got like one legitimately sort of famous person that didn't blow the podcast up, but still it was cool and gracious that he was, the singer for Everclear, is like gracious for him to come on and tell his story. And it kind of just built from there. And I just posted episode 65.
Congratulations.
And as you know, it takes some effort to do all that stuff. I spoke at one of my kids' schools about podcasting. One of the kids was like, you must make so much money doing this. And I was like, I 100% lose money doing this. I pay for all this host. Like, this is not a moneymaker. If anyone wants to pay me to do it, like, knock on my door. But like, that's not why I do it. It's not a thing.
It's a passion project.
3 questions? Yeah, it's a passion project.
You did. Yeah, I feel like the same thing with me, right? We're about to post episode 50, which we're super proud of. And it's because we love what we get to do. My story was that when we first started Sober Life Rocks, we knew that we needed to reach a larger group of people. And it wasn't just going to be through social media. It wasn't just going to be through our friends group. And so Laura, my co-founder, said, you are such a great speaker. You need to run our podcast. Like, I don't even listen to podcasts. I know nothing about podcasts. Give me a minute to think about this. And so I started digging in. And one of the things that I was thinking about was back when I was drinking, if somebody had made that kind of recommendation to me, I would have been like, ha, 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 yeah, that's really funny. And it might have bumbled around in the back of my head, but it never could have been something I could have actually executed on. And today, when these moments come, like when your wife said something, or when you had this moment at the speaking engagement, or for me, when that suggestion came, today, I can actually take those moments and give them full thought and give the time and research and make clearer decisions and then execute on things. And when I execute things imperfectly, I can make adjustments. So I'd love to know from you, because we're on the same sort of trajectory, what are some of the lessons you've learned along the way and adjustments you've had to make?
I think and I was just thinking the story last summer, I was sitting on bleachers while the 13-year-old was at a soccer thing. And a woman came up to me who I did not know. Her kid was on the other team. And she must have sort of dug in through Facebook or something to figure out but her husband was listening to the podcast. And she said it's really made a difference for him. And I was like, I didn't even know who this person was. I was like, whoa, okay, cool. So that impact, you don't have to get 50,000 people to listen to have an impact. I'm sort of grateful and excited by the growth that's come and the feedback I've gotten. So I think there's a little bit of lesson in that for me around this notion of always wanting to I want to be the rock star or whatever, that small impact is still important, right? Like I don't have to reach everybody. It's reaching people that it's helping, and that in and of itself is sort of satisfying. And then,
And go ahead.
no, I was going to say your question again.
Oh, what other lessons you've learned along the way from doing this podcast?
There's a little bit of perseverance. I think that's good. I think another lesson has always been family still comes first. So I've recorded some of these things at 6 a.m. and some of them at 11 at night. And that's what I told myself going in, that I'm going to do my best, and family still comes first. Obviously, I have a job that still comes first. I think that was sort of an important, philosophy that I've held. Maybe it's not a lesson. And I just think the big lesson is there's real value in people's stories.
Mm.
I think I don't have to agree with everyone on everything or politically or anything, but there's real value just even beyond talking about sobriety and recovery. The importance of sharing our stories is fundamental.
Mm. This is going to be airing the week of Father's Day. And so I want to say happy Father's Day to you.
Thank you.
And happy Father's Day to all of the other sober dads or sober curious or people just listening who just wonder what this journey might look like for them. Is there anything else as you think about the conversation we've had that you want to share?
Yeah, I think for me, I just, I always knew I wanted to be a dad. It is not always easy. It's interesting. I sort of joke I'm doing round 2 now, I was like, oh, the end was in sight. And then I met this incredible woman who had these other kids, and, that I am their dad. So I think it's sort of be open to what the world puts in front of you. Don't close your eyes. And I fundamentally believe, my wife's sober too. So without sobriety, there wouldn't be an us, there just wouldn't. It's just so fundamental to what the foundation of our relationship. I think also like be forgiving to yourself as a dad. Like we all lose our cool, right? We're not perfect. But I believe like when you're not, you apologize. There's always this notion you want your kids to apologize, but you should also apologize when you're wrong. I might figured that out along the way, and that's been really useful. I think kids really feel that. It's no longer do as I say, not as I do, but really kind of hold yourself to the same standards you're going to hold your kids to.
The best advice I ever got was that we're not raising kids, we're raising adults. And so I love that idea that we're role modeling what an adult behavior actually should be.
Yeah, it's interesting because my daughter in soccer, she plays at a pretty high level of league soccer. And there's a lot of the parents who are like, I want my kid to go D1. I'm like, I just want my kid to be a good human being and like be happy and like try and make some good change in the world. That's what I want. I don't care if they're don't go to college or D1 or D3. Like, I'm not invested in that. I'm invested in trying to put a good human being out in the world. Like that's my end goal.
Love that. Love that. Stephen, I am so grateful for you coming on and sharing your journey and giving us a little bit of insight into the journey of podcasting and what that's been like for you. But mostly the idea of showing us what it's like to be a man, a dad who invests in your own growth and then is willing to live your sober life out loud in sobriety and for giving other dads a place to feel seen and heard and supported. But thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And it really is, my pleasure to do the podcast. And like I said, to be entrusted with these stories is really, it's really meaningful. And I don't take that lightly.
Yeah. So, to you listeners, if this conversation moved you or touched you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who you think needs to hear it. Your support helps amplify Sober Voices and grows this incredible community. And don't forget, tickets are now available for Amplify Sober Voices, our live event happening January 15th in Orlando. Come be a part of something bigger. You can get all the details at amplifysobervoices.com. Until next time, keep showing up, stay proud, and remember, sober life rocks because you rock.